Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and to today's video where I'm going to be talking you through a few of the processes and everything for this lovely woodpecker drawing. First things first, the reference photo for this was actually taken from Pixabay, so I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to check out the reference photo that I have used for this. Also, if you want to follow along the full tutorial in real time, you can find it over on my Patreon page. I'll leave the link to that in the description as well for you. So, first things first, with this woodpecker, as always, I have started with the eyes. You guys know, if you have followed me for a while, that I always like to start with the eyes because it sets the tone for the drawing and it gives the animal or whatever you're drawing a little bit of soul. So I'm just starting with the eyes. I'm using a nice sharp pencil. I'm using a dark sepia and just going around the outside, making sure that the eye is nice and round, using a soft touch to begin with, and then going in with a little bit of a firmer pressure to really get that nice dark colour. There's also quite a vibrant highlight, and to begin with I did leave a little bit of the paper white and then just kind of added all of the dark colour around. Then I used my Holbein soft white, which is a really lovely opaque pencil. Get one of those if you can because they are incredible. I used that to go over the paper white, added in a little bit of red and blue, and then I also used my Sakura Jelly Roll pen to add two tiny little dots of really bright, vibrant highlight. This woodpecker is actually a greater spotted woodpecker. If you're in the UK, you may have seen them floating around in your garden, on your bird feeder if you have one, or in the woodlands somewhere. I'm not sure if you guys have them anywhere else in the world if you're watching, but here in the UK it's called a greater spotted woodpecker, and the woodpecker itself has areas of white, kind of dark browny black feathers, and then has this gorgeous flash of red. So to begin with, I'm adding in all of the white feathers, and the base for this I actually used an ivory pencil, and I'm making sure that when I am adding in the feathers I'm working in the direction that the feathers are going. So I'm making sure that I really analyse the reference photo, use my kind of knowledge of how feathers and everything fall around faces and then coming down into the chest and everything, and working the pencil in that way before then going in with some mid-tones, so using some more warm greys, some nougat, and a little tiny bit of brown ochre to add in the darkest details. And I'm not kind of using fur lines, I am making some lines, and I'm also just adding in some general shading as well to help to blend everything together. For the beak, as you can see here, I'm kind of adding in all of the darker areas, so adding the central beak line and any kind of dark areas towards the lighter feathers and everything. And the beak is really nice and smooth, so I'm making sure that I do blend a lot here as well, by using the white pencil and by using some of my lighter coloured pencils as well, so using the ivory, the warm grey one, that kind of thing. And then as I'm working back towards the feathers here, just adding in all of those lovely dark feathers, and we begin to add in that little kind of streak. It kind of looks like he's got a cheeky little moustache growing on his face there, before coming back in and adding in some more of those light coloured feathers. So you can see the process here. I've put down the base, I'm then going in with a slightly darker base of some warm grey 2, some warm grey 1 as well, and then adding in a tiny little bit of nougat and some brown ochre to add some shadows and some different variation there. For the darker feathers, you can see that I've put down a light base. I used a cold grey 2, and I'm using a cold grey because the feathers had this lovely blue hue to them, and you can see that on top of that cold grey 2 I've put a base of some blue, and in this case it was the Indanthrene blue, which is a really nice kind of like petrol-y, diesel-y blue tone in the Polychromos range. And then directly on top of that I'm adding in some of the darker colours, so I'm using some walnut brown on top, because if you're mixing brown and blue together they're going to create a really nice dark tone, and it's going to be a lot richer in tone than if you went straight in with like a dark sepia. So I'm making sure that I add some blues and some browns in there to create some depth into the types of colours that I'm adding in there. I'm also leaving areas of the blue showing through where you've got a little bit of a sheen on the feather. So in this particular case, the sheen and the kind of like highlight on the feather had this blue tone, so adding in this blue base, worked really nicely, because then I was able to use those blue tones for the sheen, and then adding the walnut brown and then a little bit of dark sepia on top to create the darker feathers ended up working really nicely. So we're going to see some more light coloured feathers on the wing here, as well as some darker tones as well. So as always, going in with the lighter colours first. I always find the lighter colours a lot easier to add down first. I don't know why, I always do it this way. Some people like to work with the darker colours first and then add in the lighter colours, but for me, I like to work the lighter colours first. So I've put down that ivory base as I did through the face, and then adding in some of the warm greys and then a few tiny little strokes. I am kind of using a bit more of a fur line method. If you guys aren't familiar with that, I'm going to leave a link in the description for you so you can go and follow that to kind of see what I mean. But I've used like kind of tapered lines to create some small details and some small shadows in the lighter feathers there. And then the same process on the darker feathers as what I just explained for going around the face. So putting down some light tone or some cold grey too, adding in some blue tones, and then on top of that adding in some walnut brown and some dark sepia, and just going in with like heavier pressure on the blue pencils as well. And again, on the wing you've kind of got a little bit of that sheen to the darker feather, so I've made sure that you can see a lot of that blue tone to help to create that highlight and to give that sheen to the feathers there, which is really, really important. I'm coming on to the chest area and kind of making the wing stand out a little bit here. So I've added in a lighter tone of the ivory for some of the lighter tones on the chest. I'm just going around the wing and adding in all of the kind of real dark areas. The wing, you can really see the separated feathers. So on this particular area, as you can see, I'm kind of working feather by feather and filling each individual section in, and then checking where the shadows are laying and where the highlights are and adding them in on an individual basis. So rather than colouring in or layering the whole area of that wing, you can see I'm going section by section and adding in the dark tone, adjusting, adding in some highlights, so coming back in with some lighter tone, and that also helps to blend as well. And yeah, just working a small section at a time. I find that this works really well because I tend to find that if I colour the whole section or add a base layer to a whole section, I tend to lose a little bit of the graphite, and then I kind of get a little bit lost, and it just takes a little bit longer to figure out exactly where I am from the reference photo, if that makes sense. So if I work small section at a time, sometimes when I am working from a reference on the computer, I will load it up in Photoshop and I'll add like a little blob using a paint tool or something on the section that I have just done, so I know that I've done that bit and that I'm working on the bit next to it. So there's a little trick for you if you are working from a computer and you're struggling with finding yourself in a reference photo. I find this particularly helpful with birds, especially hummingbird type birds where you've got a lot of those little scalloped feathers. That technique works really well with marking a reference photo like that. On the chest here, you can see that I'm just adding in a few details. All of the feathers on the chest are really light, so a majority of this is just made up with some ivory and some warm greys, a little bit of cold grey as well, and you can see I'm going in with some brown ochre, and I'm adding in some of the little feather details that you can see, and you can kind of identify that a few of the feathers are overlapping, and I'm adding in the shadows around there and just making sure that he's looking really nice and kind of plumey on his chest there. And you can see that the colour does get a lot like darker compared to what you can see more towards the bottom of the chest there, coming towards the tail. And the reason that I'm going dark there is because there's quite a bit of shadow, and when I do finish adding in all of the darker colours, that actually looks quite light still. So when I do add in some of the darker colours, I do go and kind of adjust some of the lighter tones, because sometimes if something is too light and then you're adding in dark tones, it can affect the way that you put down your dark tones. So I do like to go and kind of check the two against each other as I'm working, if that kind of makes sense. So as I'm working a little bit on the darker tone, I'll just make sure that the light tones are looking nice and light still, or if they're looking too dark, and just evaluate that as I'm going. So the technique that I'm using for these darker feathers down here, where they are kind of interspersed with a lot of these really light little sections on the feathers, these little markings. I'm just looking at the reference photo and again taking it section by section, and I'm kind of imagining what shapes they are and then putting that down onto my paper. So they're not like normal shapes, they're not just squares or anything like that, they are kind of all over the place shapes. So I'm making sure that I do kind of try and mark that down on my piece according to what I'm seeing on the reference photo, but sometimes I'm not going and doing things 100% exact, because I find that when you do copy a reference photo 100%, like making every single little mark and detail exactly the same, then I tend to find that things look a little bit too contrived and they don't look natural. So I take my artistic license, I suppose, and I look at the reference photo and I think, okay, there's some shapes there, I'll try and copy them loosely, but I'm not too worried about getting them 100% correct, because if I try and mimic them 100%, I find that my pieces don't look natural and they just look really static and they don't look free flowing. Whereas if I just kind of have a general idea of the shape or something that I'm making or trying to create or add in, and then add it in on my piece and kind of how I kind of want to interpret it, then I find that my pieces look a lot better, if that makes sense. We're getting to the fun part on the woodpecker, and that is adding in his red bum. I loved this section. I just used some ivory as a base, and then I've gone in with some scarlet red. Mixing the ivory and the scarlet red kind of creates a little bit of a lighter tone, because obviously the ivory is a little bit of a yellow hue, and then adding that into the red, it kind of gives a little hint of kind of a bit more of an orange tone to the scarlet red. And then I've used some dark red for some shadows, and I'm also adding in some dark indigo as well for some of the shadows through there as well. For a few more of the kind of orangey, gingery parts of the woodpecker that you can see, I've just used a little bit of green gold, which is a wonderful colour to use. I don't use it enough, and I really want to find a piece where I can fully go in with a green gold pencil. To create the overlap, I'm making sure that I work the red upwards into the white, so coming in the opposite direction that the feathers are flowing. That helps to give it a really natural look and overlay there. And I've also used a little bit of the white pencil to help to come over from the white into the red, and I've also used some of the Sakura Jelly Roll pen as well to add in a few white details which are overlapping the red, which I couldn't get by using the white pencil. So now that the woodpecker is completely finished, I'm turning my attention to the feet, which is the part that I dislike the most when I'm drawing birds. I really struggle with bird feet. This is one of those times where I just kind of look at the reference photo and I look at the shapes and kind of look at what kind of colours are going on, and I don't really pay too much attention that I'm making feet. I just pay attention to the shapes and the colours, and then somehow magically it all comes together, and I'm never sure why, because I always fret and take the longest time over feet and everything like that. And the last portion of this tutorial is just me going and making the bark. I've only filmed half of the bark portion for this because I didn't want it to be too repetitive. But the bark essentially is a base of warm grey 1. The bark here has some really lovely warm tones, so I used the warm grey 1, but if your bark had a bit more of like a blue tone or something, then you could use a cold grey 1 or even a blue pencil as a base. But my bark here was nice and warm toned, lots of lovely oranges, nice warm toned greens, browns, that kind of thing, so I used the warm grey 1 as the base, and then gone over with some warm grey 2 to add in the areas where the most prominent shadows are, and then I'm working on those most prominent shadows by adding in some of the darker tones, using some walnut brown, some nougat, and all of those lovely brown tones. And the kind of mark that I'm making with my pencil when I'm doing this is I'm using a scumbling technique, which is small circles which are overlapping, and that helps to create, in some cases it creates a smooth surface if you are focusing those circles really close together, but in this case I'm leaving the circles quite looped and open, and I'm not worrying about going over each individual one over and over again, so I'm leaving the circles quite open, and it's creating this bobbly texture. And I'm doing that with all of my layers here, and then every now and then I am adding in a little bit of a shading motion as well to help to blend. But mainly just using those circles and making sure that they're quite open-ended, and then where I do have a bit more of a concentration of colour, I am moving the circles closer together, much like you would if you were creating a dense patch of fur. You would create lots of little lines together to really get that saturation of colour. So I'm using the same kind of technical aspect here of grouping the circles closer together where I do have a lot more of a saturation of colour, but also kind of trying to keep them loose and further apart to create the texture of the bark. And I do find that using this technique to create the bark creates a quite natural looking texture. It is a tedious one, this, and you do have to kind of work over and over and over it, and I think what really makes the bark is adding in sharp little pinpoint details with some darker pencils, so adding in the shadows, all of that kind of thing. I think when it gets round to adding in all of those, that's when the bark really comes to life, whereas if you're just kind of adding in the small circles and creating that kind of bobbly texture, sometimes it just can't, it takes a long time to bring it to life. So if you are struggling with bark, it does take a little while and it does go through an immense ugly stage, but you just have to really stick with it, and then eventually, once you come to adding in the details and adding in those pinpoint little details and those darker colours and everything, it does start to really come together. And I find that the more bark that you add, the better it looks. So if you're just working on a small patch of bark, it tends to not look as good. But if you're adding in like a vast patch of bark, it does look a lot better when there's a lot of it together, and you can kind of, your mind kind of says to you, oh, that's bark, whereas if it's just a small patch, you're like, what on earth is that? So if you are drawing bark or adding this kind of texture into your drawings, make sure that you are adding a fair amount of it rather than a small amount. I know adding a small amount may seem like the better option because then you don't have to draw as much of this really tedious texture, but believe me, it does look better when you add more of it in together, and you'll see the difference if you ever decide to draw this texture. But those are a few short technique tips and colours and everything that I've used for this woodpecker. As I said, if you want to follow along in real time, the full thing is available over on Patreon. I'll leave a link below so you can check that out. But I really hope that you have enjoyed this video and that you really love my woodpecker bird. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.